mute them. And we'll let folks know in a separate email where to access the recording. So if you don't get a message about that, please do let Cynthia Bettner know. That's me. Also, we're going to hold off on questions and answers until after each segment of the presentation, each presenter. So write down the questions that you're looking to have answered. So, Tom, I think you could go ahead and start recording now.
Okay, we're recording.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank Tom Luthier and Florence Peterson from the U.S. Forest Service out of Durham, New Hampshire for setting up this webinar and making this possible. I'm Cynthia Bettner. I'm with the Silvio Conti National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, and joining me today as speaker is Ted Elliman from the New England Wildflower Society. We're representing the Connecticut River Watershed Invasive Species Partnership. And I'd like to also thank Karen Lombard from the Nature Conservancy in Mass and Stacy Light from the Invasive Plant Atlas of New England, who provided slides for the reporting end of this presentation. So just to give you a sense of the webinar today, I'll be providing an overview of what's happening in the Connecticut River watershed, and then Ted will take over with the identification of early detection species, those species that are new to the watershed. We'll have questions and answers actually after my presentation and then again after Ted's. And I was originally going to have a whole separate section on reporting, but that's now all included within my presentation. So, so that part will not be happening. So the idea, what we're kind of getting across in this presentation is that by the time a plant's recognized as a problem by the public, it's actually too entrenched to easily control it, easily or in a cost-efficient manner. Purple loosestrife is a plant that a lot of people will recognize, and my coworker here, Gloria, back in 1995, found some on the Prescott Peninsula of the Quabbin Reservoir in Massachusetts. And there was just a single plant, and because she knew this plant, she said, I'm going to dig that out. I'm going to get rid of it. I know what it can do. And lo and behold, this is what it looks like. No, not really. This isn't what it looks like today. This, I did talk with the land manager just last year and asked him how the purple loosestrife situation is out in that field. And he said, there really isn't any. There isn't any. And so it just goes to show that even with common species, it's possible on a site basis to prevent new invaders from really taking off. Here in the Connecticut River watershed, we're looking at that more thoroughly, how to keep new invaders out. There's a new partnership that started, and we've gathered to do that. And just to give you a sense of what this partnership is doing, we have 6 cooperative invasive species management area partnerships, or SISMAs, within the watershed. And I'll show you where those are. There's one in the upper Connecticut River watershed, which entails 9 pretty large watersheds in itself. So this is a pretty large group. The idea of a SISMA, or a Cooperative Weed Management Area, CWMA, is to gather together all the people that are concerned about a particular area. They live there, or they work there, or they know that there's really special things happening there, and they'd like to see invasive species brought to a minimum and protect the natural resources and the natural communities in their area. And so usually these areas are small enough that people can actually wrap their minds around them and really make things happen. So this is a quite large one in the upper Connecticut River watershed. And then there's one in the upper White River watershed, one in the Ottaquechee, the Westfield River, and I'm going to give you a few details about that just to give you a sense of what these groups are doing. So in the Westfield, this group started in late 2009, and they've been doing a lot of mapping to get a sense of what's actually there, which species are problematic and where they exist. They've been doing a lot with outreach, trying to raise awareness in their community, working with conservation commissions, highway department personnel, landowners. In fact, the landowners guide that they developed was in part used from another initiative up in Vermont. So the idea is that we're trying to share information across the watershed, trying to teach people about these new invaders and just the common species as well, to encourage people to control them on their own properties. The next one is the Farmington River, and that is the smallest one. It deals with just a 14-mile stretch of wild and scenic designated river. Another small one is in the 8-mile watershed, where you would think that because it's in southern Connecticut it might be inundated with invasives, and yet there's still really great pristine areas that they're trying to keep that way. Right now we're working under a 2-year grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is providing seed money for both priority projects in those 6 localized SISMAs. And we've also formed an ad hoc watershed-wide steering committee, which we're not quite sure how long this will last or whether it's just to get the ball rolling, to facilitate communications between those smaller groups and set the stage for priority projects at the watershed level. This committee is looking at the full watershed, and we've termed it the Leadership Initiative. It has representatives from the 6 local SISMAs, as well as a number of other organizations that deal both regionally and statewide in each of the states of the watershed. This is a large watershed. It encompasses 7.2 million acres. So it's really trying to do things at a full watershed level is quite difficult. You'll notice that the organization I work for isn't actually on this list, which was an oversight on my part. I work for the Silvio O. Conti National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, and our boundaries are the Connecticut River watershed. So it's the one and only watershed-wide National Wildlife Refuge in the nation. We've also linked up with a lot of the other organizations and agencies dealing with natural resources in the watershed or in the states that comprise the watershed, and so they're all acting as resource to our project. So this is the entire partnership in all. And what we're doing under this grant is networking and education among the SISMAs. We're doing an analysis to begin to prioritize the most biologically important places to control invasives and to possibly form new SISMAs. And a major focus of this grant is on early detection and rapid response. And we're trying to develop a protocol for that we can use within the watershed so that we can teach people what they should be looking for, what's heading their way, and how to report it, and then what to do about it. And we're just in the beginning stages of that right now. So there are a lot of species already a lot of invasive species already in the watershed, and some are quite new to the watershed. Some are quite new to regions of the watershed. And of course, there's always things coming in from all angles as well that we need to be aware of. Japanese stiltgrass is one of the species that is spreading quickly up from the mid-Atlantic states through Connecticut. It's being found more and more in southern Massachusetts, and even up here in Northfield, Mass., which is just a few miles from the border of New Hampshire, it's been found. So we're trying to raise awareness about this and other species. And to do that, we've been holding a number of training sessions so that people can learn what they need to be on the lookout for. That's Ted in the upper right-hand corner of the slide at a recent training. We've divided the watershed into 3 regions: the lower, the middle or central, and the upper Connecticut River watershed. And we've been doing these trainings in the lower 2. The upper is still relatively pristine, and so all species, even if they're common in the southern watershed, are still considered EDRR up in the upper. This presentation is dealing with the lower Connecticut River watershed. So how to report sightings if you find any of these, and Ted will be going through and showing you how to identify what features to be looking for and how to tell them from some of their most close lookalikes. Well, here in the southern watershed, we're using EDMAPS, which is a national database, and the portal for EDMAPS is the Invasive Plant Atlas of New England website. So you can access these reporting mechanisms through these websites. And there's actually a couple phone apps that you can use for reporting in as well. They'll take the GPS location, you can take photographs and submit all that, and they're uploaded automatically where they end up as unverified records in that database and then are verified. So this is what the EDMAPS website looks like, their home page, and you would click on Report Sightings there in the upper left, and that's what the Outsmart Invasive app looks like on the right there. It's pretty intuitive how to upload information, but there is training that I'll show you how to access as well. So this is a national database, and you can view things by state or by county. And as I mentioned, that website directs you to the Invasive Plant Atlas of New England, where you go in to report a sighting and then choose which state you're reporting from, and that includes all of the New England states. And this lower circle here showing iPain 2.0 webinar, that's the webinar that will teach you how to navigate through this reporting system if you can't figure it out by yourself. IMAP Invasives is a website and database that's used in Vermont instead of EDMAPS. People can still submit things through EDMAPS to Vermont, but the official database is IMAP Invasives, which has some good features as well, and they have online trainings. We're hoping to get these 2 databases to better communicate with each other so that we'll have all that data all in one place eventually. So what about the rapid response part of EDRR? So what happens when these reports come in? Well, this is all just in its beginning stages, so you'll have to stay tuned for that. We're even just in the first stages of making sure the whole verification system is working correctly. We have some volunteer botanists who've taken on the job of verifying for various counties in Massachusetts, and then there's a verifier for Connecticut as well. There are some species that are already being addressed to some degree for rapid response. Japanese stiltgrass that I showed you already is one of them. And that's getting to the point now where we're encouraging site-level rapid response. It's getting to be so prevalent in Massachusetts that we just don't think we can rein it in overall. So we're trying to get more word out about that particular species. Another one that is considered not EDRR for the entire state, but we're still trying to keep it out of water bodies within the watershed, is water chestnut, and that's a project that's overseen by the refuge I work for, the Silvio Conte National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, and we're working with a number of partners to make that happen. The lower left picture there is showing what water chestnut can look like if left to its own devices. That's Log Pond Cove in Holyoke, Massachusetts. It's an annual, so if we can prevent it from producing seeds and catch up with the existing seed bank, the idea is that we can really get it to a level that's manageable or even eradicated in some water bodies. These are the ways that we've been trying to control it there in Log Pond Cove, and that just shows the importance of early detection and rapid response. We never would have had to get to this level of work and the expense involved if it had been caught early. So people are reporting in when they find this plant, and for smaller infestations like this, or even much larger ones, we've been able to get volunteers out working on water chestnut. We have a youth conservation corps that helps each summer, as long as the federal budget enables us to do that. And you can see the piles that we've pulled out. This was from the Chicopee River on the lower left there. So just to give you a sense of the success of that program, that took us days and days to clear out the Chicopee River back in 2007, and it is down to just probably 1 day's worth of work and much less this year. So we've really made great strides on that particular species. Mile-a-minute vine is another one where action is being taken in the watershed and throughout the state of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Biocontrol is used on the larger infestations in eastern Mass and in Connecticut, and this plant is an annual and can be hand-pulled. Herbicide is effective. Those are the towns where it's been found in Massachusetts, which is really only a few in the watershed at least, and the state agencies, Natural Heritage and Department of Agricultural Resources and Department of Conservation and Recreation have been working hard to try to bring this species under control. And yet it's also getting to the stage where it's getting difficult. So the more we can find and catch at that early stage, the better. So how can you be involved? You can watch for and report these early detection species and report them in, which will alert the rest of us. Control them on your own land or land that you manage for your organization, and volunteer to help control them in your community and the region. And become involved with a local SISMA if one exists, or start a new one. So if you have any questions on this portion of the presentation, feel free to give me a call or email me. And you can also contact Zara Dowling, who's actually moving on to do some graduate work. So we'll still keep this invasive coordinator at gmail.com email going until for the time being. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, I guess we'll get on with Ted's presentation then. While that's being uploaded, I'll tell you a little bit about Ted. He's been working in the whole region for the New England Wildflower Society, doing invasive plant management and educating people about both common species and early detection species. He's now switching over to a new job within the society. He's updating the Newcombs, or creating a new Newcombs type field guide for New England flora. So we're lucky to have Ted joining us today and presenting how to identify these early detection species. So take it away, Ted.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, hello, everybody. This part of the presentation will focus on 16 early detection species. So I'll be talking about a few things kind of in a preliminary way, early detection in general, and then going on to the identification features that'll help you really focus in on how to clearly identify some of these early detection plants. Reason for doing this is that with some of these early detection plants, they have several look-alike species out there, some of which are native, and it's quite easy to confuse them. And so there are times when we get false reports of early detection species that turn out to be natives or turn out to be maybe non-native but not invasive. So this will help really help people clearly identify those early detection species in the field. So this opening shot here, that's Cynthia in the left hand there pulling up stiltgrass in the watershed. That was actually one of the first stiltgrass populations discovered in the watershed. And this next slide, it may take a little time to download, is just acknowledgement. So when putting this early detection list together for the southern part of the watershed, I did consult with a number of people from state natural heritage programs, botanists who spend a lot of time in the field, people with IPAIN, EDMAPs, IMAP invasives, and TNC programs. So I just want to acknowledge all their help here. They're certainly very important in helping to put this early detection list together. And the next slide, couple of slides, show some of the common invasives in the southern part of the watershed, and often in other parts of the watershed as well. But just some that I'm sure people who are on the phone are familiar with. So got a shot of about a dozen of the more common species here. And some more of them right there. Really won't spend any time on them because we're focusing on those that are just getting into the watershed or have a very scant presence there. What is the definition of early detection? And Cynthia's already touched on that. It's an invasive plant that has a limited presence in a region, but it is spread very rapidly in areas that are adjacent to the region in question. And so that's one part of the definition. The other part of the definition really is that it's possible to control it successfully within the region. So, it's not one that's become so widespread or well-established that control is out of the question, but one where there still is a potential, if not to eliminate it completely, then at least to reduce its numbers where it's not really a threat to natural habitats. So here's a graph that shows on the vertical and on the horizontal axes what's kind of a typical process of a species escaping from cultivation, and then what happens over time to its distribution and also to the potential for controlling it. So if you look on the lower left, what it shows there is when a plant is first introduced accidentally or in cultivation, then it starts to escape. And as you see on that dotted line there, as time goes on, the number of acres it infests begins to increase slowly at first, and then going farther over to the right, it really increases exponentially. So as this process is taking place, eradication or really good control is only possible really in the early stages. And by the time people generally, as this has happened, by the time people begin to recognize that it is a problem and the scientific community gets on top of it, and then by the time the public really becomes aware of the problem, it's often only possible to control the species on a very sort of site-specific basis. It's become so widespread that kind of general control within the area is not possible due both to the prevalence of the species and also how much cost is involved to try to manage it at that point. So with early detection species, what we're trying to do is discover them early, sort of that early stage in the graph where control is still feasible in a cost-effective way. So this next slide, Cynthia already showed this slide, and that's the three divisions of the watershed. So the lower Connecticut watershed that we're talking about being the Massachusetts and Connecticut parts of the watershed. The species that we're going to talk about today, and there's 16 of them, and I've divided them here into their different life forms. So trees, actually I have forgotten a tree there. Calorie pear should also be there. We'll talk about that in a second anyway. Be there under the tree list. And I've also, in error, have the title here as Central Connecticut River Watershed. This is the southern. These are the species for the southern portion of the watershed that we're talking about. The first one, the first tree here is Amur cork tree. Philodendron amurans, which is a tree that's native to North Asia. And it started to escape, really where it was first introduced was the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. It was also introduced to a number of other botanical gardens in the area and arboretums. And it's been escaping, particularly along river floodplains and in moist forests. So those are the kinds of habitats that you're most apt to find it in. It grows to 30 to 50 feet in height. Usually it's an understory tree under the canopy, so it doesn't get up into the canopy, say, of maples or an ash and other trees that are around it. But it becomes very prevalent in the understory. And some of the important ID features for it are that it has compound leaves, so it has 5 to 13 leaflets comprising each leaf. It has a very corky bark, so you see on the upper right that the bark has these high ridges. It has these high ridges to it, and that's also something that's very distinctive about Amur cork tree. And if you cut into the inner bark is bright yellow saffron in color, so it's a very bright and distinct color. I should mention too that the leaves, if you crush those leaves, the leaves have a lemony kind of fragrance, so they have the citrus fragrance to them. So that is also a distinctive feature for the Amur cork tree. The tree that looks most like it in the wild are native ash trees. So like Amur cork tree, which is on the left, the ashes here are on the right side of this image, the ash trees also have the compound leaf composed of, in the case of ashes, 5 to 9 leaflets. And as you see, the buds, or the twigs and the buds are also somewhat similar. Differences between the leaves, first of all. On the ash leaves, the edges of the leaflets have teeth. They're all serrated. Whereas in the Amur cork tree, those leaflets are entire. There are no serrations or teeth on the edge of those leaflets. So that's a good feature to identify one from the other with the leaves. Also, the ash leaves do not have that lemony fragrance. With the buds, you can see with the ash twig that it has a true bud on the end, right at the end of the twig, whereas with the Amur cork tree, the buds sort of go around the end. They kind of surround the end part of the twig, but they don't actually are not actually perched on top of the end of the twig. The fruits are very different between the two. So the ash have these long, slender fruits that can just sort of disperse by the wind, fall down to the ground, elongate, flat, and thin. Whereas the Amur cork tree fruits are these berry-like fruits that turn black when they're mature. So the fruits are very different, and the bark is different too. Again, that corky, rich bark to the Amur cork tree. whereas with the ash, it has a very finely ridged pattern to the mature tree. Some very old ashes might get some of those quirky ridges, but that would only be on the very, very old ones. So normally, what you see here with the typical patterns on the mature trees of both species. A map, and these maps I have, I should explain first of all, are based on data from both the IPAIN, Invasive Plant Atlas of New England, EDMAPS program, and also combined with some information for Vermont from the IMAP Invasives program. Circled in red there, that indicates that red outline there indicates the area of the watershed, and the green are those counties in which, in this case, amber cork tree has appeared. I should say it looks like the whole county is covered with these trees. That's not the case at all. It may just be one town within that county that has that particular invasive tree in it. So you get an idea there about the distribution in the watershed. And those numbers on the right give the number of populations in the EDMAPS IPAIN database for Connecticut and Mass, the number of populations in the watershed for that particular species, and also the dates of the first discovery of it and the most recent observations. So in the case of amber cork tree in Connecticut, 5 known populations in the Connecticut watershed. First was in 2003, first documented, and the latest in 2011. Okay, going on to the next, it's calorie pear, Pyrus calleriana, and this is one that is of particular concern in Connecticut. It's one that's often planted as a street tree, and it was believed to be sterile, kind of a sterile cultivar of this species, but it's turned out that it does indeed produce fruit, and it does spread. It can the trees can breed successfully and produce viable fruit. So calorie pear, the features are that these white petaled, the 5 petaled white flowers that are about 1 inch in diameter. It has leathery leaves, 2 to 3 inches long and about 1.5 inches to 2 inches wide. It blooms very early in the spring. And the fruit that it does produce are these very small pear fruits. So you see that on the upper center photo are these very small fruits. And it gets in, besides the roadsides where you see it planted, it gets into thickets, young woodlands, and edges of fields and meadows. So those are the types of habitats that it occupies. Some differences between the common pear, Pyrus communis, and the calorie or the Bradford pear. Again, the calorie or Bradford pear on the left with the small fruits, the common pear with the very large fruits. And there's some subtle differences in the size of the leaves. So the leaves of the common pear are slightly smaller, but that's not necessarily a good sort of character to go by because there is overlap. And with the flowers, too, there is some size overlap. But the flower, the common pear, is a little bit larger, and in the middle of the flower, the common pear has 5 styles. So right, what you see are sort of surrounding, if I can get that dot on it, see surrounding, around the middle of the flower there. Those black tipped are the anthers or the male reproductive parts. In the middle of those, there are the female reproductive parts or the styles. Can't see it too well, but there are 5 in the common pear, and in the Bradford or calorie pear, there are 3. But again, the size of the fruit is undoubtedly the best feature to identify to distinguish those 2 species. Okay, those are the 2 trees, and unfortunately I don't have a map of the calorie pear. I should say that now. It's not really been considered an early detection species until recently, so it's one that much better documentation is needed for, especially where it's gotten into more natural habitats like thickets, woodlands, and meadows. Going on to shrubs, the first one up here is the Amur honeysuckle. Lonicera macchii, and it's similar to some of the other non-native invasive honeysuckles, and we have several of them around. I'll show an image of one in the next slide. But the Amur honeysuckle, although similar in kind of general form, it grows 15 to 20 feet in height. It has an opposite leaf pattern. It produces these red berries. The bark, when it gets older, is kind of shreddy. It inhabits woodlands, riversides. It gets into thickets and field edges. Those are the kind of habitats you find it in. But what's distinctive about this is that from the other honeysuckles is that if you look at the leaves on the upper left image, they taper to a sharp point. So there's a clear taper to the leaves in the Amur honeysuckle. So I'll go on to the next slide, comparing it, the Amur honeysuckle, both with one of our invasive honeysuckles, which is the Morrow's honeysuckle on the far right, and a native honeysuckle, which is the American fly honeysuckle, or Lonicera canadensis, the shot in the middle there. You can see the taper on the leaves of the Amur honeysuckle, whereas with the Morrow's honeysuckle, they're blunt-edged. Really, the leaves are much more blunt. When they come to a point at the end, they're more rounded. And with the native with the Native American honeysuckle, the leaves have this oval shape, also rather blunt tip, but they have this oval shape that you can see there. Another feature that helps to distinguish the Amur honeysuckle is that the fruits, when it produces the berries, they look like they sit right on the twig. So the fruits have very short stalks. They're almost sessile on a twig, looking like they're sitting on top of the leaves. With both the Native American fly honeysuckle and the other invasive, the Morrow's honeysuckle, the fruits have these stalks. So you can see that best with the native one, where you see the long stalk of the fruits. But that's also true of the Morrow's honeysuckle, so they're more extended away from the leaves. Anyway, Amur honeysuckle is the one that's quite new to the watershed, or being newly documented, and one that's been spreading pretty rapidly in the southern part of the watershed in recent years. So that map of EDMAP's data for Connecticut and Massachusetts showing it's become somewhat widespread in Connecticut, still quite limited in Massachusetts, but it's one that certainly much more documentation is needed for. I should mention, too, distinguishing native from the non-native honeysuckles is that all the non-native shrub honeysuckles that I mentioned have a hollow pith. So the twig is hollow on the inside, where with the native honeysuckles, the stems, the twigs are solid. So they don't have sort of that hollow core that they do, say, for the Amur honeysuckle or the Morrow's honeysuckle. The next is a willow, rusty willow, Salix atrocinerea. There's some discussion about what the actual correct scientific name should be. So in some sources it's called Salix cinerea. But at any rate, willow, it's one of a number of willows in our area, and willows are often hard to identify. There are many of them. They look, in many cases, very much alike. But it turns out this invasive willow, this rusty willow, in eastern Massachusetts at this point has come to dominate a lot of the wetland areas. And what people used to think of as being the common pussy willow or the Bebb's willow turned out, in fact, to be this invasive rusty willow. So it's one that's been somewhat under the radar screen in terms of its spread and invasiveness, but one that clearly is becoming more abundant, and we have to really get a handle on where it's located, what wetlands it's infested, and get a jump on controlling it. So some pictures here of the rusty willow and ways to identify it. One is that it leaves out very early in the spring, and it holds those leaves late into the fall. So a lot of the willow species do develop quite early, but this one, I'd say particularly in the late fall, will hold its leaves. So that's an image of it in the middle of a marsh on the upper left there. Another feature on the upper right is that the mature stems of the rusty willow have ridged bark. So the bark, if you feel it, it feels sort of, you can feel these ridges in it. It's sort of a muscly texture to the ridges on the mature stems of the rusty willow. And then with the leaves, a good feature to identify it is the red hairs on the underside of the leaf. So you can see that on the image on the lower right, is that the leaves have these reddish hairs. It helps to have a hand lens when you're looking at this in the field, but it does have these distinctive red hairs on the underside of the leaf. To go on to the next slide, I did mention a couple of the other willows that it looks very much like. So to just mention a few of the features that help identify the rusty willow from the pussy willow and the Bebb's willow. One, if you look at the rusty willow leaf on the upper left, again, it has those hairs underneath, and if you look at the way that the veins run out to the edge of the leaf, those veins are running out right to the leaf margin. So looking again at those parallel veins running right out to the leaf margin. With the pussy willow on the upper right, those veins break and bend inwards or bend in a perpendicular way to the main axis of the vein before they reach the edge of the leaf. So it's a subtle difference, but that's one to help you tell them apart. Also, the pussy willow does not have those red hairs underneath. Okay, now with Bebb's willow, the leaves are very similar, but ways to tell the invasive rusty willow from Bebb's willow. One, looking at the rusty willow buds. The rusty willow buds are of two sizes. The larger ones, the flower buds, are large, and the leaf buds are smaller, considerably smaller than the flower buds. So you have those two sizes on the same twig, whereas with the Bebb's willow, the buds are all the same size. So that's one feature to help identify the two. And then with the bark, I mentioned the rusty willow having this muscle-like bark, whereas with the mature Bebb's willow stems, it has this diamond pattern to the bark. So the bark of the two shrub species there is quite different. So unfortunately, they all hybridize, or the rusty willow does hybridize with pussy and Bebb's willow, and that's one problem we're having with it. So there are some shrubs with intermediate characteristics, but I think you can see enough, certainly in the field, especially those red hairs under the leaf and the ridge bark for the true species to get a good handle on it. Okay, with the next slide showing its distribution in the watershed, and it's certainly been underreported. So at this point, IPANE EDMAP showing only one population in Connecticut in the watershed, and actually zero in Massachusetts, according to IPANE and EDMAP, but that certainly isn't the case. It's much more present. We just don't have a good tracking record of it yet. And this is just a map of its rapid spread in eastern Massachusetts, since two botanists associated with the Arnold Arboretum have started to track it. And again, in eastern Mass, it's really dominating wetlands. And I'm sure the same is happening in other parts of the watershed. Okay, going on to a very well-known plant that we've all heard a lot about because it's so prevalent in the southeastern U.S. is kudzu. Pueria montana variety of lobata, but it is here in New England also. And as you probably know, it's a vine, a woody vine, that can grow way up in trees 60 feet or higher, climbing clear up to the canopy, smothering trees, shrubs, clambering all over thickets and meadows. So it's an extremely destructive plant in the South, and in certain cases, even here in New England, it's been causing some problems. Identification features for this one are, one is the leaf. Not only its very high climbing habit, but that very large three-parted leaf, and that the leaf is very, very large, and with three kind of leaflets that are kind of rounded in outline. In midsummer, it produces a spike of purple flowers, so you see that on the left-hand image, so a big spike of purple pea-like flowers, so looking very much like a pea plant flower. And those flowers will develop into these fuzzy pods. So you see that on the right. It has pea pod-like fruits, only they're very fuzzy on the outside. So those are ways to identify kudzu. It's really unmistakable. But we have gotten some false reports of it, people identifying actually some native members of the pea family as kudzu. So I've just put a couple of those species up here for a comparison. But before mentioning those species, just showing a couple of infestations in Massachusetts of kudzu. The one on the lower left being in the town of Needham, where it covered until it was managed a couple of years ago. It covered about half an acre in an abandoned lot, just going 50 to 60 feet up some oak trees and just sprawled everywhere. And the one on the right is a site in Martha's Vineyard where it done a similar thing on a very steep slope. It covered, in that case, not quite half an acre, between a quarter and half an acre, just a sheer cover, a carpet of kudzu. And there you see it also clambering up. I don't know if that was an old tree or some part of an old structure, but climbing up right there. Two natives that have been mistaken for it are native members of the pea family. The one on the upper left, roundly thick trefoil, Desmodium rotundifolium, is actually a creeping plant. The leaves look somewhat similar to kudzu, but they're much, much smaller, and this plant just creeps along the ground, usually found in oak forests, so not in sort of open conditions, abandoned lots, thickets, roadsides that you see kudzu in. Another one that has been mistaken for kudzu is groundnut, Apios americana, another native species with, it's also got a number of leaflets to it, but in this case, more than 3 leaflets. You see often 7, 5, 7, 9 leaflets with the groundnut. And this one usually occurs near wetlands. It's got a spike of purple flowers, but it's more of a scrambling plant that doesn't grow up high like kudzu. But just a couple of things to keep in mind if you think you see kudzu. Okay, anyway, there's a shot of the Needham site after it was managed by the state. Just wanted to show how successful control was in a case where they got right on an early detection species, and in one treatment managed to control 80 to 90% of the infestation. There's a shot of the distribution of the map of kudzu distribution in the watershed. 2 populations in Connecticut in the watershed, the Massachusetts populations to the east, at least up to this point. But I know a group, I think Cynthia and a group found a new kudzu population in Connecticut, actually inland from where most of them are, just a couple of years ago or so. So it's one certainly that we just have to keep in mind for this part of the watershed. Okay, another vine that a woody vine that is getting into the southern part of the watershed. It is fairly widespread already in Connecticut, but just more becoming established in Massachusetts is porcelain berry, Ampelopsis brevipetunculata. And this is a member of the grape family. It's closely related to grape. And like grape, it's a vine that climbs, so it can get fairly high up into trees. The distinguishing features for porcelain berry are, one, the shot on the lower left actually probably shows it best, are the leaves have these deep lobing. So in comparison with most of our native grapes, which have shallow lobes, porcelain berry, at least some of the leaves on the stem, will have these very deep lobes. And the fruit is different from grapes. They're very light blue or light purple, sometimes white, and they have these black kind of speckles on them. So, and they're not sort of rich and succulent. They are a little soft, but not sort of succulent or edible like grapefruits are. So the next slide will show some comparisons with porcelain berry on the left, and this one showing the deep lobing of the leaf and a close-up shot of the fruits, whereas with the native grape, that much more shallow lobing, and of course the very familiar grapefruits. I would just say with the leaves there is variability. So not all porcelain berries, especially younger ones, will have this sort of deep, sort of classic lobing to the leaf, and some of them may look more like grape leaves. But another way you can that helps to identify the porcelain berry is that the stems will have hairs, especially near the leaf. So if you look for hairs on the stem, and you see some reddish stem, hairs on the leaf stalk and also on the main kind of stem near the leaf. If it's got those hairs, there's a very strong likelihood it's porcelain berry. The grape just doesn't have those hairs. But again, the best features are the deep lobing of the leaf with porcelain berry, and of course, when the fruits are there, they're unmistakable. Okay, in this case, I do have a township map, the iPaint EdMaps township map, showing locations of townships rather than just counties where porcelain berry has been documented in New England. And in the watershed, there's 16 known pops in Connecticut, and at this point, 6 in Massachusetts. Okay, going to herbaceous plants now. So, herbaceous species. The first of the herbaceous plants is wild chervil, and Priscus sylvestris, which is a member of the parsley family, like Queen Anne's lace or carrot. They're all related to each other. And like Queen Anne's lace, it has these clusters, technically called umbels, of kind of flattish-topped, very small 5-petaled white flowers. They're all clustered together on these ray-like spokes. Again, that's called an umbel. And so that's sort of a common feature to these members of the parsley family. And with the wild chervil in particular, what helps to distinguish this from other kind of look-alike parsley family plants with white flowers is that shot on the upper right of that fern-like leaf. So wild chervil has this very fern-like leaf, and you might, if you don't have the flowers but just have a leaf, you could mistake it for a fern. Wild chervil will grow up to about 3-4 feet in height. Often occurs along roadsides, thickets, meadow edges are the typical habitats you see it in. It's much more common in Vermont than in other parts of the watershed, but it has been spreading down into Massachusetts, and it's certainly given that, it's certainly likely to become a more common feature in the Connecticut landscape as well, unless we start getting on it and controlling it. The next slide will show some look-alike plants to wild chervil that are, also in the parsley family. Wild chervil, again, with those fern-like leaves on the left, and the look-alike plants on the right. The one that looks the most like it in terms of its leaf shape is a non-native species called poison hemlock. Okay, so that also has fern-like leaves. It's not invasive. Poison hemlock is not invasive. It does have these fern-like leaves, but in contrast to wild chervil, the poison hemlock will get very tall. It gets up to 7 feet in height. And it usually has a purple blotch stem, so a stem with some purple markings on it. It's a bigger plant, purple blotch stem, and the leaves aren't quite as finely sort of fern-like as the wild chervil are. So ways to tell those two apart. Other plants with somewhat similar leaves are, I'll start on the actually the lower bunch. One is a non-native caraway, carii, that it usually doesn't escape from gardens, sometimes does, but has much more wispy and delicate leaves. Then there's Queen Anne's lace on the lower right, and that one also kind of wispier leaves, very common, as you know, as an escape, but not sort of these really finely divided, pointed fern-like leaves on the Queen Anne's lace, but kind of a slighter, kind of a frailer-looking leaf for that one. And then also there's hemlock parsley. The leaves of that look somewhat like Queen Anne's lace. This is a rare plant that occurs in cold swamps usually, so wetland habitats for this rare native plant. But they, wild chervil, again, the height and the green stem helping to distinguish that from the poison hemlock, which is the one that superficially could look the most like it. Also, I will point out one more subtle difference. On the wild chervil, the fruits, the tip of the fruits have what looks like these little caps on them with kind of a small straight beak that you can see in the image there. So that's a unusual feature for the fruits of the wild chervil that helps to identify it from the fruits of the others. Okay, and there's a map showing the distribution of the wild chervil in the entire watershed and Vermont, again, having the most species, having the most populations by far, far fewer known in Massachusetts or in Connecticut. The next one is narrow-leaf bittercress, and that is a member of the mustard family, similar, looking superficially anyway, similar to garlic mustard in some ways. Like many members of the mustard family, it has small white four-petaled flowers that occur in a cluster near the top of the stem. With the narrow-leaf bittercress, the leaves are very divided into sharp pointed leaflets. So you see that on the upper right image, and you can also see it on the lower left image. You see the leaves on the stem divided into sharply pointed leaflets. The basal leaves, too, shown on the lower right, are also divided into these lobe-toothed leaflets. So those are some features that help to identify the narrow-leaf bittercress, which grows up to about 3 feet in height. 2 to 3 feet common height range for it, occurs in moist woods, occurs along stream banks, under canopy. It's one that can really get into natural habitats, into swamp edges, so those are the kinds of moist, wet soil habitats that you often find it in. Going on to some of the lookalikes and features that help to identify the narrow-leaf bittercress. On the upper left there, that shot showing the base of the leaf of the narrow-leaf bittercress. And what you can see here at the base of the leaf are these little appendages right there, and they clasp the stem. So the base of the leaf is clasping the stem on the narrow-leaf bittercress, and that's a unique feature. The other bittercresses, lookalikes, don't do that. So there are a few lookalikes: small flowered bittercress, native Pennsylvania bittercress, also native, a cuckoo flower, non-native, but those three are quite common in the landscape, or fairly common. But the leaves are different. None of them have those none of those has those clasping feature at the base of the leaf stalk there, and also the shape of the leaflets don't have those sharp points. Go on to just briefly talk about hairy bittercress on the lower left. That one is another non-native species that's been spreading around, usually in lawns is where you see this one. That can be distinguished by the hairy, the petioles of the leaf. The leaf stem are hairy, so there are hairs on the stem of the leaf to the hairy bittercress, unlike, say, narrow-leaf bittercress or those other bittercresses. So again, that leaf feature to narrow-leaf bittercress, those clasping appendages around the stem, the best identification feature for that. And there's just a shot of where narrow-leaf bittercress is actually out-competing garlic mustard in a situation I saw in a deciduous woodland in northwest Connecticut. So it had completely taken over an area where garlic mustard had been. It blooms, I'll just say, it blooms somewhat later than garlic mustard. It blooms, say, late May as opposed to early May, so about a month later than garlic mustard does. And there's indication of its distribution in the watershed. Connecticut has a number of recorded populations, becoming far less common as you go northward. The next is pale swallowwort. Black swallowwort may be familiar to many people. So pale swallowwort is almost identical to the black swallowwort. Member of the milkweed family, a herbaceous vine that twines around other vegetation, kind of scrambles, and develops these milkweed-like pods kind of later in the season, a very distinctive feature of it. It can be distinguished from the black swallowwort. The pale swallowwort can be essentially by its flowers. That's the only good way to tell it apart from black swallowwort. I should mention, of course, both of them extremely invasive. Pale swallowwort having light pink or light purple petals and very narrow petals. So that's the key to identifying the pale swallowwort, Seneca rossicum. The black swallowwort having broader petals that are maroon, or very kind of a deep, dark color on the black swallowwort. Other than that, they occupy the same habitats, and they're similarly invasive. And there's a good possibility of what has been identified as pale swallowwort. What has been identified as black swallowwort is actually pale swallowwort. So we should get a better handle on the actual distribution of pale swallowwort, and that can really only be done when the plant's in flower. So quickly, that map is black swallowwort, showing it all over the watershed, distributed everywhere, not early detection at all. Whereas pale swallowwort, much more scantily documented, especially the farther north you go. Connecticut has 18 populations, Massachusetts 12. But again, there is a chance that there has been some mistaken identification. So early June to mid-June, when the plant is in prime flower, is the best time to be out and documenting this, the pale swallowwort. The next one is giant hogweed, and this one, I'm sure people have heard about. It's more of a threat to human and livestock health, actually, than it is ecologically, for the most part. It's another member, like wild chervil, of the parsley family, but this is one that gets very tall. It's a huge plant. It gets up to 15 to 20 feet in height, and this is just all growing in 1 year. The stem is hollow. There's a picture in the stem in the next group of slides. The stem is hollow and usually blotched with purple. The leaves can be 5 feet, actually, altogether in length, and are deeply and very sharply toothed, as you see in that shot in the upper left. So those are features of the size of the whole plant, the size of the leaf, and also this very large dome-shaped umbel or cluster of flowers. So that can have a diameter of 2 feet. So all parts of this plant, just enormous, and there you get an idea of scale with the guy there standing next, not too close, but standing next to the giant hogweed. Okay, another just showing some other shots, giving you a sense of the scale and also color of the stem. One thing to mention, too, is that there are, from this main point on the upper stalk here, the main stem, rather, there are 50 to 150 rays leading out to these flower clusters. So that's good, too, for identifying the giant hogweed. 2-inch diameter stem there, and again, just showing there the how big that umbel of flowers is. It gets into roadsides, meadows, thickets, kind of disturbed habitats, ditches is where you have to find this. Okay, and why is it a problem? Well, if you're exposed to the sap of the giant hogweed in sunlight, it has phytotoxic properties, and people can get very deep burns from giant hogweed. So it's a dangerous plant. And the same is true to a greater or lesser extent with other members of the parsley family. They can cause skin rashes and burns, so you have to be careful with all members of this family. But hogweed is the one which causes the most severe damage. Okay, there are some plants in the same family that look like it, and the one that is most similar is the one on the far right, the native cow parsnip. Showing the leaves of that, they're kind of similar to giant hogweed, but the leaves are not quite as sharply divided. You see the giant hogweed in the very sharp and deep divisions, somewhat shallower on the cow parsnip. The cow parsnip will get tall too, up to 7 feet in height, but it won't get 15 to 20 feet in height. There may be 20 to 50 rays in the flower spokes that I mentioned, as opposed to 50 to 150 in the giant hogweed. So again, there's similarities, but it's not nearly as big. The flowers aren't as big, and the leaves aren't nearly as big on the cow parsnip as with the giant hogweed. Then there's some other big members of the parsley family. Purple stem angelica is one, but that has a much more deeply divided leaf. That's a native wetland species. The wild parsnip, a non-native that should be watched for its invasiveness, should mention that. The wild parsnip has yellow flowers, so that's distinctive about that. Another one to be very careful with for skin burns. So this image here showing this person touching the wild parsnip, that's not a good idea, okay, because that, like giant hogweed, can cause skin burns. And then again, with a poison hemlock, that can get big. It's a member of the parsley family, but of course the leaves on that are fern-like and very different from the giant hogweed. Okay, the giant hogweed distribution in the watershed. It may not be, it's probably not been mapped enough, and as you get to the upper part of the watershed, very little is known about it. In Connecticut, 9 known populations, Massachusetts, 2. This next shot will show its general distribution. Massachusetts, known in about 40 towns in Massachusetts across the state, and there's a cluster of them in the Connecticut watershed, sort of in southern Massachusetts right there. So it is around, and certainly one to, for its health hazards to keep an eye on. Next one is another scrambling plant. It's an annual herbaceous scrambling plant that has probably flown under the radar screen, but it is one that is spreading, and that is Japanese hops, Humulus japonicus. And it's got a very bristly stem. It's got as you see on the leaf on the upper left, it's got a leaf that's divided into usually 5 to 7 lobes, so a lobed, quite a lobed leaf with sort of a narrow sinuses between the lobes. Again, the stem is bristly, kind of very harsh to the touch. And then a feature, the flowers are kind of obscure, kind of greenish, yellowish cluster of flowers it has. But when it develops into fruits, the fruits that these flower clusters develop into are spiny tipped. It's got these bracts that are spiny tipped, and that's a good way to identify this plant too, or the spiny tipped fruits. The lower two images showing its habit, kind of scrambling over other vegetation, doesn't climb high, but it'll scramble in old field situations or kind of low thickets. You can see it as a scrambling species. There's not too much else that it resembles, but there is a common hops, which is a non-native species that's not nearly as bristly. The stems have kind of a few small bristles or hairs really on it, but it's not strongly bristly. The leaves are generally 3-lobed, maybe 5-lobed, but not sort of 5 to 7 lobed like the Japanese hops is. And also on the fruits of the common hops, which is the beer hops, you don't have the spine-tipped bracts that you see on the Japanese hops with those very spiny bracts on the fruit of it. So a way to tell those two apart. And here's the distribution of Japanese hops in the watershed, certainly one that I'm sure is underreported. So this is the iPane EdMaps map showing the townships, 6 each in Connecticut and Massachusetts, but in certainly in eastern Massachusetts, people have been noticing spreading around, and it should be watched in the watershed. The next is Himalayan jewelweed, Impatiens glandulifera, and this is like our native jewelweeds or touch-me-nots. It's in that family and has some characteristics in common with our yellow and orange touch-me-nots or jewelweeds. The Himalayan jewelweed having purple flowers, so you see that on the upper left, occasionally white, so you'll see some albino forms to it, but white or purple flowers. It also gets much taller than our native jewelweeds. It gets up to 6 to 7 feet in height. And where it occurs is in wet meadows, ditches, floodplains, riverbanks, so it likes wet soil, and wet meadows, and again, floodplains of rivers where there's some open canopy are the habitats you're most apt to find it. And also find it in ditches along roadsides. So those kinds of habitat types. Okay, this shot showing its differences from our native jewelweeds, and there on the upper right we have the spotted touch-me-not, Impatiens capensis, which is the orange flower with black spots, and the native pale jewelweed below that with the yellow flowers. So the color of the flower of the Himalayan jewelweed or ornamental jewelweed on the left, purple flowers, very different. And also with the leaves leaf patterns are different. So with the Himalayan or ornamental jewelweed, the leaves come out opposite each other on the stem. With the native jewelweeds and the 2 native species, the leaves are alternate on the stem, so not coming out opposite each other. And also with the Himalayan or ornamental jewelweed, the leaf stalk there and the bases of the leaf on the edges have these glands that you can see right there. The native jewelweeds and native touch-me-nots do not have those glands. So you can tell them apart pretty easily. Like our native jewelweed, though, it does have a very succulent stem, the Himalayan does, and if one were to pull it out, it pulls very easily out of the ground. And there's a map of its distribution, and as you see, what's surprising about this, compared to most invasives, which are much more common in the southern part of the region, this one far more common in Maine, much more common, and in the Connecticut watershed itself, more common in the northern part of the watershed, but really Maine is sort of the central distribution point. But people have been noticing some populations recently in Massachusetts, so 9 populations now in Mass, 2 in Connecticut, and one, as it's moving, this one moving southward to watch in those kinds of moist to wet communities that I mentioned. Japanese stilt grass, and this is really one of the major threats. Grass that I'm sure people have heard about, but has probably for a while went under the radar screen because it is easy to mistake for some of our native grasses. This one, the Japanese stilt grass, is an annual grass, so it does die back every year. The features for identifying it, the best features are, one, the leaf. And the leaf has, on the upper side, it's got a silvery stripe, a silvery translucent stripe on the upper side of the leaf, which is, the leaves are lime green in colored. And this is especially good if you see it reflected in sunlight. You can see that silvery stripe on the upper side of the leaf. Another good feature for a stilt grass, on the far right, it shows the roots. And the roots are very, very delicate, thread-like roots, very shallow roots. So when controlling this plant, the only good thing about it, in terms of its control, is it pulls right out of the ground. So you can yank it right out because it has these delicate prop-like roots that you can see there on the upper right. That's the inflorescence that's shown, or really when it's in fruit, shown in the middle of the upper images. It's a grass that goes into flower very late in the season, so it doesn't flower until mid-August, mid to late August, and it doesn't develop these fruits and seeds usually until early September at the earliest. So September is when it goes to seed and spreads its seed around. But during the season, I should say those seeds are viable in the soil for a long time, so it does keep coming up. And it just, in terms of its ecological impacts, it just takes over massive areas of the ground floor in forested communities and also in open areas. One reason it's such a big threat is that it occupies a number of habitats, so it gets into floodplain forests, wet meadows, swamp edges, as well as more upland situations too. So you see it in upland forests sometimes, and even in some dry meadows. So a number of habitat types where you see stilt grass, but it prefers some moisture and some shade. But again, it's got a real range of tolerance for different community types. Okay, showing the difference between one of its main lookalike grasses, which is the native white grass, Lyrzia virginica. Japanese stilt grass, again, that silvery stripe. The Lyrzia virginica, the native white grass, has roughly similar leaf, occurs in the same habitat types, but does not have that silvery stripe on the upper side of the leaf. And with the native Lyrzia virginica, the white grass, it's a perennial grass with a tough rhizomatous root there. So the underground part of the white grass is this tough, knotty rhizome, and if you try to pull out a single stem of the white grass, it'll resist, so you have to really tug at it to get it out of the ground, whereas with stilt grass, it just rips right out. So there is a difference between those two. And the inflorescence can be a little tricky between the two, but anyway, the white grass on the top without what you see on the stilt grass, which are these projections off each individual, say, fruit there. These projections called awns. Often stilt grass will, but not always, will have these awns. The white grass never does. But again, I think the leaf and the roots are a better way to tell these two apart. Distribution in the watershed. See a couple of maps briefly later showing how rapidly stilt grass has spread. Anyway, at this point, 53 populations in Connecticut, so it's really beyond the point of early detection sort of in a general way, but on a site-specific, more pristine habitat basis, it still is very much an early detection species and should be treated as one. Massachusetts in the watershed now have 20 known populations in the watershed, and a lot of these have just been documented in the past few years, not known in New Hampshire or Vermont yet. So 1984 is when it was first found in Connecticut, first documentation in Brantford, and then just a shot 25 years later showing its distribution, and this is out of date. It's much more widespread in Rhode Island and Massachusetts than this map is indicating now. So very rapid spread of this Japanese stilt grass. The next one is wall lettuce, Mycelius muralis, a member of the aster family. And this is one that isn't so familiar. It's been more common in the northern part of the region, but it is moving southward. And it's being seen increasingly in Massachusetts and northwest Connecticut. It's been documented too. So one that's certainly showing up more and more. This one looks sort of like our native hawkweeds or like our wild lettuces. It has that general form. Some features that are distinctive about wall lettuce, Mycelius muralis, to help identify it. One, in the drawing here in the middle part of this slide, what you see are the flower of this, that unlike most members of unlike other hawkweeds or lettuces and other members of the aster family, for the most part, this has 5 petals. So when you see wall lettuce, the flower will only have 5 petals, no more than that. The leaf is this divided, segmented leaf that has a clasping lobe at the base of the leaf. So the leaf really clasps the stem with those with those lobes there, and you see that little indentation between the lobes, so it really clasps the stem. The upper right image there shows the bluish kind of cast to the stem. So that color is pretty distinctive too. It's got a kind of a bluish green color to the stem. And there too you see the leaf, the base of the leaf really clasping the stem. The terminal leaflet, the terminal segment to the leaf is much larger than the lateral part. So that's shown there in that middle right image. So those are ways to tell the wall lettuce. And what kind of habitats does it get into? It gets into swamp edges. It gets into moist deciduous forests. It gets into stream courses, and it's one species that can invade high-quality habitats that often are otherwise quite pristine, like mature sugar maple forests, sugar maple white ash forests. It gets into that kind of habitat, and it will spread rapidly and outcompete sort of native herbaceous species. Okay, I mentioned a couple of lookalikes, one being the wild lettuce that's shown on the left, and the hawkweeds, this showing panicled hawkweed, but any number of hawkweeds having pretty similar flowers, but those species having many more than 5 petals. Okay, there's one other species that actually looks a lot like it too that I did not mention in the previous workshop, and that is nipplewort, Lapsana communis, where the leaves can be confusing. So the Lapsana also having the segmented leaf with often the larger terminal leaflet, but again, many more than 5 petals with the nipplewort, and that 5 petal with the wall lettuce. So the distribution in the watershed, more populations in the northern part, one at least recorded in EDMAPs in Massachusetts, none so far recorded in IPANE EDMAPs in Connecticut, but it's in those states. And in Massachusetts anyway, just shown up in eastern Mass in several locations, and because it's wind dispersed, it can spread very widely and rapidly, and so one to be on the lookout for. Mile-a-minute vine, which is another that, like stiltgrass, has really spread very rapidly in our area. And this is an herbaceous annual vine, so it dies back in the wintertime and just grows new growth in 1 year. And this one, it just spreads over thicket areas, woodlands, gets into some kinds of wetlands like marshes and swamp edges, can climb quite high and climb onto shrubs, lower edges of woodlands, and will scramble over meadows. So the image of the upper right showing a huge infestation of mile-a-minute, that one from the mid-Atlantic states. But we do have one very large infestation, somewhat similar to that one in Massachusetts, in eastern Massachusetts, where it covers 60 acres. So it is here, and it spreads. It can spread very rapidly if it's not caught very quickly, detected and caught very quickly. Okay, ways of identifying this. One is that the leaves are triangular, almost an equilateral triangle that you see on the upper left image, and they're on long petioles. The petioles and the stems all have these barbs, so these very sharp barbs on them. It's no fun to kind of pull this out with your bare hands. You'll rip the skin, and you'll rip up your clothing working with this one. So those are identification features for it. I should mention, it's in the buckwheat or the smartweed family. But unlike any other member of that family in our area, it produces these blue, kind of porcelain blue fruits looking like these blue berries right there. So in the image on the lower right there, these blue berries being a good identification feature for it. The flowers are very small, kind of closed, greenish-white, very inconspicuous flowers, but they do form these bluish fruits. And the next slide will show something else about it. There are lookalikes, but I should point out, too, about the mile-a-minute. It also, on the stem, has these circular bracts, or these circular leaf-like structures here on the stem, and often right underneath the flowers and the fruits. You get this circular bract, and the stem just pierces right through that circular bract right there. These look-alike plants do not have that circular bract. Again, this image showing the long petioles doesn't show well enough the barbs on the stem. Those are sharp barbs and very visible when you're just looking at the stem. The lower left one there showing those circular bracts again. Okay, some look-alikes. There's a member of the same family called climbing false buckwheat that scrambles over shrubs and thickets, but it has no barbs at all. So that one's related to myelominate, but it doesn't have any barbs. So that has been mistaken sometime. Hedge bindweed in a different family altogether. It's got those big white trumpet-like flowers, very common plant. And it does scramble over other vegetation as well. No barbs on the stem, and a totally unrelated plant, the hedge bindweed. There are two native species that have small barbs on the stem, both of which look somewhat like myelominate. And these are, again, natives that occur generally in swamp or marsh habitats, and you're apt to see it if you just go out, apt to see them go out for a stroll near wetlands. One is the arrowleaf terethum. And if you look at that, the leaf sits right on the stem. It doesn't have a long petiole, and the shape of the stem, shape of the leaf, is really quite different. It isn't sort of a broad triangular shape to it, again, on that long petiole. And the barbs are very, very small. You'll know it when you handle this species, but the barbs aren't as large as they are with the myelominate. And the same with the halberd leaf terethum, which is another wetland species, and looking somewhat more like myelominate. There are petioles to the leaves, and there are these basal lobes that flare out from the halberd leaf terethum. So that, plus the small barbs on it, can give you an impression of myelominate. But the leaf is not more that equilateral triangle shape that you see with myelominate, and you don't get any of those circular bracts that you see on myelominate with the halberd leaf terethum. Also, the blue fruit that you see on myelominate is very different from any of these. You don't see that blue fruit on any of these other species. So where is it? In Massachusetts, it's spread very rapidly. So that's first discovered in Mass in 2006. So it's been spread around just in the past 6-7 years, detected in a number of other places, including the northern part, the northern Massachusetts, in the watershed there. So those four populations, Cynthia mentioned them, getting very close to the border, both with New Hampshire and Vermont. And there's a map of its distribution in the watershed. So Connecticut, it's certainly more widespread than that, than having just 3 populations in the Connecticut part of the watershed. Massachusetts with 2. But it's one that should be detected. It should be surveyed for more because it does spread so rapidly, and it has been spreading so noticeably in New England. Okay, now going on to a few aquatic invasive species. The first one here is Hydrilla verticillata. And there are a number of aquatic species, invasives as well as natives, and superficially they can all look quite similar. So really some careful looking is often necessary to identify some of these aquatic invasives. But Hydrilla has these these whorls of small leaves on the stem. And it covers, as that slide on the upper left shows, it covers whole large areas of surface areas of water bodies, so lakes, ponds, slow-moving streams. They can cover very vast areas of these kinds of water bodies. And the leaves, again, they occur in whorls on the stem. So whorls of 3 to 8 very small leaves on the stem, each leaf being 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch in length. And there are spines on the tips of on the margins of the leaf, And also on the underneath of the leaf, the middle vein on the underneath of the leaf has spines as well. So those are good features for identifying hydrilla, especially the spines on the underside of the leaf. That's unique, really, to hydrilla. Another good feature for hydrilla is that if you were to pull the stem, of course, you know, the stem is submerged underwater, but pulling up the stem, what you see at the base of the stem are these little tubers right there. So these root-like structures are these little round tubers, and that's a feature that is very distinctive about hydrilla. So again, the whorl of leaves, 3 to 8 leaves, whorls, that's variable, the number of leaves in the whorl, spine tipped on the mid-vein underneath, and what are technically called turions, or these little tubers at the base of the submerged stem. So those are features to identify hydrilla. There are a couple of lookalikes, one of which I should say is also invasive and one to watch for, and that's Brazilian waterweed. It looks like hydrilla, but it does not, if you pull up the stem, it does not have those tubers. It lacks the tubers, and it does not have, it has teeth on the edges of the leaf, so spine-like leaves on the edges of the leaf, but it does not have the spines on the on the mid-vein underneath. So that's those are differences with hydrilla. It also, the leaves are somewhat larger. There might be a little overlap there. Leaves are somewhat larger than hydrilla. And when it does flower, it has a very conspicuous flower. It doesn't always flower, though, but it has this white flower. Hydrilla has a very small, inconspicuous flower. But again, this one is also invasive, so if you see this one, it certainly should be reported as well. There are a couple of native water weeds, native Elodius species, that do look like hydrilla. Differences between the native water weeds, and we do get reports of these sometimes. People think it's hydrilla or the invasive water weed. But the native water weeds, again, they don't have those root-like tubers at the base of the stem. And the leaves are almost always in whorls of 3. They're not variable like 3 to 8, or some whorls have 5, some have 4, some may have 6. And these almost invariably, the leaves are in whorls of 3. And there are no spiny tips on the underside of the leaf. So no spine, on the midvein, there are no spine tips. So ways to tell that between those and hydrilla. Hydrilla is known in Connecticut, part of the watershed, and I think by now there is at least one population known in the Massachusetts part of the Connecticut watershed, but still so far not too well known, but it's one that spreads very rapidly. It spreads by boats, it spreads vegetatively. It probably got into water bodies originally just by being dumped from aquaria. And that way of introduction is still a threat, so one to really keep your eye on in aquatic situations. Another aquatic invasive is yellow floating heart, and this one more common in the southern part of the watershed. Yellow floating heart has a leaf, as you see in the lower leaf, like other kind of water lily-like plants. But the flower really is very different. It has 5, it's got this very open flower with 5 bright yellow petals that you see here on the upper left. And it can form these massive infestations, slow-moving in ponds, slow-moving streams. Again, you see that infestation on the upper right. So those open petals, big flower, the flower is an inch or slightly more in diameter, so big yellow flower, open petals, forms massive infestations. And when the flower becomes a fruit, it's got this sort of cylindrical fruit that's beaked. So you see that in the image there in the middle lower image, a beak-like fruit. So things to keep in mind when you're identifying this one. What are some aquatics that look a little bit like it? It really doesn't look like too much else. But we do have the native nufar, our yellow pond lily species. But there again, the flower really looks closed. Okay, so the flower, the actual petals are on the inside here, enclosed by these sepals. But the whole flower really looks closed in that case, not the 5 open petals. So that's the way to tell those two apart when they're in flower. And also when the yellow pond lily is in fruit, it's got this ribbed, kind of reddish, cylindrical fruit that's very different. That's very different from the beak cylinder of the yellow pond lily. So the fruit looks very different as well. Just a couple other shots. Then there's the small yellow pond lily that's similar but much smaller than the yellow pond lily. This one a very rare species. You're not apt to encounter it. And then there's the white floating heart, which is an Invaders cordata. It's got open petals like the yellow floating heart, but the flowers are white, and of course not yellow. And this one is also an unusual plant. You don't see it that much. Much smaller. The flower is also considerably smaller than the yellow floating heart. So those would be the lookalikes, or just vaguely lookalike to the yellow floating heart. Okay, for its distribution in the watershed, it's probably not been mapped as widely as it should be. There could well be more populations of it. 8 known in Connecticut, a couple in Massachusetts, but not a recent record in Massachusetts, and then a very rather old records in Vermont. So one that's certainly one of concern in Connecticut. Here it's probably more widespread than it's been documented, and one, again, as you saw in that image, very invasive in aquatic situations. Okay. The next shot is one that Cynthia showed a slide of in her part of the presentation, and that's water chestnut. Familiar, probably the most familiar invasive aquatic, and one that you're not apt to mistake with any other species. The leaves, the rosette of wedge-shaped leaves, those toothed triangular leaves, and that whole rosette, they all occur together. Wedge-shaped leaf, and their teeth right there. So very distinctive. And when the flowers become fruit, those very spiny, four-pronged fruits that you really can't mistake with anything else that occurs here in New England. So very easy to recognize and identify. And like the other invasives, it will colonize huge areas of slow-moving waters, ponds, lakes, and slow-moving streams. It has been documented in the Connecticut River, in tributaries, and in other waters in New England. But one that once it does infest can take off very rapidly and can become very costly to control, requiring a lot of major industrial equipment. So if one sees a small population, it's important to jump on it very quickly. You can hand pull out small infestations in canoes, and done over a period of years, as we've been working on some, that can be effective in controlling them. So that was the last species they're showing anyway. Before go on to the last slide, the distribution, the EDMAPS map of water chestnut in New England, and they're showing it in Connecticut and Massachusetts occurrences and townships within the watershed. And this last slide is just some resources that are available for more information about these invasives, links to management, so showing links to EDMAPS, IPANE, IMAP invasives, and then the various states in the watershed, their invasive plant web pages, and also our own at the Wildflower Society, and one that's I got some of my images on, particularly good with the rusty willow, but also many invasive images at the Salicicola website. So places to go for more information. Okay, so that wraps up my part of the presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions?
Okay, I don't hear any questions. Thank you.
Ted, I do have a question.
Okay.
and that I think might be good to actually have on the recording of this. So if you wouldn't mind going back to the jewelweed.
Sure. Might take me a second here.
Sure.
Okay, got it.
When I was seeing the sample that you brought into one of our workshops, I realized just how huge this plant really is, and I realized that there might be some other plants that aren't jewelweeds that may be mistaken for it, larger plants with opposite leaves. And you mentioned to me that that gland at the base of the leaf that's on the next slide is really good.
Yeah, yeah. Did you want me to show that again? Or?
Yeah, if you could.
Yeah. Is that up? Do you see that now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so if you look at these opposite, you see in the upper left there, you got the opposite leaves, and you see those glands, you know, sort of coming right out of the stem there, where the leaves sort of attach to the stem, those brown-tipped glands.
Yep.
And then you go along the leaf petiole, you'll see more of those glands on the edge. And also there's some of the glands even at along the teeth of the leaf. So those are good features. You know, hand lens might be a little bit helpful for these, but these are visible to the naked eye. And the native jewelweeds don't have that at all.
Nor other plants.
Certainly that you're apt to see, you know, with those, you know, with the opposite leaves that are going to occur in wet soil. I don't know of any other plant that does that.
Okay.
No.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. I should just continue it. It's got a very weak stem, so even though it's a big plant, it pulls right out. Succulent, soft, very weak stem.
So for those of us trying to control it, that will we have
that
something
helps.
in its favor.
Right.
Good.
Right.
Good. Well, thank you so much. And
okay.
I think we'll wrap it up, and we'll make available this recording to others who might like to see it. So thanks again, everyone who's tuned in.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you, Florence and Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Florence and Tom.
Thank you.
So is the recording off now, Tom?